The sound of Linda's high heels reverberated sharply through the house, growing more pronounced with each step. Brian, hunched over his laptop at the dining room table, was buried in his work, unaware of everything around him except for the flickering screen in front of him. The only noise filling the room was the monotonous ticking of the clock until the sudden clatter of her heels shattered the silence. His gaze slowly lifted, unfocused at first, before it sharpened on Linda, who stood at the doorway. She wore a white dress, tight, eye-catching, and undeniably seductive. That dress, he hadn't seen it in ages. It clung to her frame in a way that demanded attention. Her lips, painted a daring shade of red, curled into a smug, self-satisfied smile as she turned slightly, admiring her reflection in the hallway mirror. Her hand slid down her hips, smoothing out the fabric with deliberate, provocative care. For several seconds, Brian could only stare, speechless and frozen in place. A creeping sense of dread slowly tightened around his chest, like the distant rumble of an oncoming storm. "Linda," he managed, his voice shaking, tension threading through every word, "where are you headed?" She didn't respond right away. Instead, she adjusted her hair, running her fingers through it with a slow, almost taunting grace. Each second of silence between them grew heavier, like a rubber band stretched to its breaking point. The tension in the air felt almost tangible, ready to snap at any second. When she finally turned to look at him, her eyes were cold and distant. This wasn't the woman he'd been married to for the past 28 years. "I'm going out tonight," she said, her voice unnervingly calm. "I'm meeting my lover." The words fell from her mouth as casually as if she were talking about an everyday errand. Brian shoved his laptop aside and rose to his feet, as if the weight of her confession had hit him like a blow. "What do you mean?" His voice faltered, his mind struggling to absorb her shocking statement. "You're not going anywhere," he added, his voice edged with rising desperation. There hadn't been any plans for tonight. Their lives had been so quiet recently, marked by simple dinners and nights spent side by side on the couch. "With who?" he whispered, his voice barely audible, a heavy knot tightening in his gut. Her smile stretched wider, brimming with satisfaction. "With Stephen," she answered, the nonchalance with which she said his name driving a painful lump into Brian's throat. "Stephen?" His voice broke. "My manager Stephen." The words tasted bitter on his tongue. His heart raced, as if the walls were closing in on him. Sweat beaded on his forehead as he searched her face, hoping to catch even the faintest sign of a joke, praying this was some cruel prank. But her expression didn't waver, she looked distant and victorious. "Yes, your manager," she affirmed with a dismissive wave, as if the gravity of the situation didn't even register. "We've been seeing each other for almost a year, Brian." It felt as if the ground had vanished beneath his feet. The calm that normally defined him evaporated in an instant. His fists clenched at his sides, his whole body quaking from a tumultuous mix of shock, disbelief, and growing rage. "What the hell are you talking about?" His voice shook, but he held his ground, refusing to look away. "This isn't real, Linda. It can't be." She folded her arms over her chest, her posture defiant, almost as if she were daring him to dispute her. Linda looked at Brian with a chilling, mocking glint in her eyes. "I'm not bluffing, Brian. Stephen makes me feel things you haven't in years. I promised him an unforgettable night." Brian recoiled, as though her words struck him harder than any physical blow. "This is insane," he snarled, spitting out her lover's name like it was venom. "You're leaving me for him. Stephen is a player. He doesn't give a damn about you." Her eyes turned icy and defiant. "And you do. When was the last time you looked at me that way, Brian? You've become a shadow of the man I once married. Predictable. Dull. Stephen makes me feel desired." Brian stood motionless, as if he had been struck by lightning, unable to fathom what was unfolding before him. The woman he had shared nearly 3 decades with stood there, admitting to an affair with his manager. His fists clenched so tightly that his nails bit painfully into his palms. "You can't do this, Linda." She rolled her eyes, clearly exasperated. "Don't you dare tell me what I can or can't do. I'm not following your rules anymore. This marriage ended a long time ago, and I'm done with this charade." Brian's anger swelled like a massive wave crashing onto the shore. "You're seriously willing to throw it all away? 28 years, Linda. 28 years of memories. Everything we built. You'd risk all that for this? For a cheap fling?" Her face tightened with irritation. "It's far more than a fling. Stephen is the one who makes me feel alive, something you haven't done for years. You've become a hollow shell of the man I married," she continued coldly. "And I refuse to pretend I'm content anymore." Brian took a step closer, his jaw clenched so hard that pain radiated down his neck. "I don't care what you think of me," he growled, his voice low and thick with restrained fury, "but tonight, you're not leaving. Not with him. Not with anyone." Linda raised an eyebrow, a mocking smile spreading across her face. "Don't even try to control me, Brian," she hissed. "You never had any power over me, and you never will. I made Stephen a promise, and I intend to keep it." Brian's heart thundered in his chest as he stared at her, struggling to wrap his mind around her audacity. "If you walk out that door," he warned, his voice shaking with a final, desperate resolve, "then we're done. Do you understand, Linda? This is the end." Linda hesitated, her eyes narrowing slightly as if she were weighing his words. Then, with a casual flick of her hand, she dismissed him as if he were nothing more than an annoying speck of dust on her sleeve. "You're pathetic," she spat, her voice sharp and cold, each word cutting deeper than the last. Brian's breath caught in his throat. He remained paralyzed, as if shackled in place, while Linda turned away from him, her movements calm and indifferent. She picked up her purse and strode toward the door. Each of her footsteps echoed through the room like the unrelenting ticking of a clock, counting down the last moments of their marriage. "Linda," he called after her, his voice heavy with desperation, "if you leave now, don't think about coming back. I mean it." She kept walking, not even hesitating. The door creaked open, letting in the chill of the night air, an unwelcome guest in their home. Then came a soft, resolute click as the door closed behind her, severing her from his life once and for all. Brian stood rooted to the spot, staring at the closed door, as if sheer willpower alone could make it swing open again, hoping she would change her mind and return. But the house was empty now, filled only with suffocating silence, broken by the relentless ticking of the clock on the wall. His heart hammered in his chest, a mixture of confusion and rage tightening around his lungs. Slowly, he crumpled into a chair, his trembling fingers rubbing across his face. The weight of what had just happened bore down on him, a burden he was utterly unprepared to carry. She was gone. Not just for tonight. Gone from his life, from their relationship, from everything they had painstakingly created together. The crushing truth of her betrayal wrapped around him, squeezing his heart like a merciless vice. His eyes fixated on the space where she had stood just moments before. Now, only emptiness lingered. Memories of the decades they'd spent together flashed through his mind like shattered fragments of an old film reel. Dinners. Trips. Quiet nights together. All of it seemed hopelessly fractured in an instant. For the first time in 28 years, I was truly alone in a house that felt impossibly large and unbearably empty. I sat there, swallowed by a silence that seemed endless, my thoughts spinning back to our last exchange, her mocking laughter, the cruel words, how she had walked out as if none of it meant anything. Gradually, something within me shifted. The shock began to solidify into something darker, more resolute. My jaw set, and a steely determination settled over me. She thought she could just walk away, leaving me shattered, believing my world would crumble without her. But she had no idea what awaited her. My gaze wandered around the room, landing on the framed pictures hanging on the walls. Those snapshots of joy, once frozen in time, now haunted me, reminders of a life that had been stripped away. She was willing to throw it all away for a meaningless fling with her manager. Fine, but that didn't mean this was over. I abruptly rose from my seat, a sense of clarity hitting me like a surge of adrenaline. The path forward was no longer unclear. Only one course of action remained, and I'd follow it on my own terms. Sleep was a distant, unattainable notion that night. I lay there in bed, motionless, my eyes glued to the ceiling, the events of the evening playing on a relentless loop in my mind. The sound of Linda's heels clicking on the hardwood floor, her venomous words, and that cold, detached laugh circled through my thoughts like a storm that wouldn't let up. The woman I had devoted nearly 3 decades to had chosen to leave me for someone she claimed made her feel alive. The betrayal hit like a bolt of lightning, as if the ground beneath my feet had given way. My entire world lay in ruins. Yet, amid the wreckage, another sensation began to stir: revenge. As the hours crawled by, my grief mutated into something sharper, something icier and more focused. I wouldn't plead for her to return. There would be no apologies, no desperate attempts to salvage a marriage that had been broken beyond repair. Linda had made her choice, and now she would have to live with the consequences. When the first rays of morning sunlight pierced through the curtains, I made up my mind. I climbed out of bed slowly, splashed cold water on my face, and stared at the reflection in the mirror. The man staring back at me was no longer the same person who had been blindsided just hours before. This man was determined, unshakable, and ready to reclaim his life. Without a hint of hesitation, I got dressed and went straight to the kitchen. The silence in the house pressed down like a heavy weight, but I shoved it aside. There was business to attend to. Seated at the dining table, I picked up the phone and dialed my attorney's number. After a couple of rings, a familiar yet drowsy voice answered, instantly sharpening with attention. "Brian, it's quite early. What's happening?" "I need you to initiate the divorce proceedings," Brian stated, his voice steady and resolute. There was a pause on the other end. "Are you certain about this? Divorce is a serious decision." "Absolutely," he responded, his determination unwavering. "No delays. I want everything finalized swiftly and cleanly." "All right," his attorney agreed, now fully focused on the task at hand. Brian ended the conversation and released a slow breath. His lawyer had explained that it would only require a few signatures, but Brian was determined to expedite the entire process. After setting the phone down, he leaned back in his chair, his gaze locked on the stillness of the empty kitchen. It was done. There was no turning back now, and that's exactly how he wanted it. Linda wouldn't be able to sway him again with her charm, sweet words, or hollow assurances. He would ensure she never got another opportunity to deceive him. His next move involved their shared bank account, which they had managed together for many years. But he wasn't going to let her use their joint savings to run off with Jeff. With a decisive motion, he transferred all the money into his personal account, leaving the joint account completely drained. Linda had made it clear she didn't need him anymore, and now she wouldn't see a single cent of his money. Once that was settled, his focus shifted to the house. The place that once stood as a testament to their shared dreams and hard work had now become nothing more than a prison filled with bitter memories. Without a moment's hesitation, Brian contacted a realtor and put the house up for sale. "Are you certain you want to sell it this quickly?" the agent inquired, picking up on Brian's urgency. "Without a doubt," Brian answered coldly and firmly. "Price it low. I just want to be rid of it." By midday, everything was already set in motion. The divorce papers were being prepared, the bank account was cleared, and the house was officially on the market. The rapid pace of it all left Brian feeling slightly off-kilter, as if events were unfolding faster than he could entirely grasp, but there was no room for hesitation. Linda had made her decision, and now Brian would ensure she faced the consequences, alone. He sat back down at the kitchen table, taking one last glance around. This place was no longer a home, it was just an empty shell echoing the remnants of what once was. His gaze landed on the framed photographs still hanging on the walls, reminders of joyful times, vacations, holidays, birthdays, all now tainted by her betrayal. He stood up and approached the nearest frame, staring at the faces frozen in time. There he was, standing beside Linda during their anniversary trip to New York. He had believed they were happy then. Maybe they were, or perhaps it had all been a facade from the very beginning. With a deep sigh of resignation, he took down the photo and placed it face down on the table. One by one, he removed each picture, leaving the walls bare, stripped of all traces of the past. He couldn't bear to look at them anymore. When the final frame was gone, Brian returned to the kitchen. Grabbing a sheet of paper, he hastily jotted down a brief note, "You made your choice." He positioned the note on the kitchen table next to the neatly arranged divorce documents his lawyer had sent earlier. The stark reality of the situation was now undeniable, leaving no room for delusions. The masquerade was over, the lies, the false pretense, every bit of it had come crashing down. Brian threw one last look around the room before snatching up his car keys. He didn't want to witness her reaction, whatever words she might utter, however she might try to handle it. He no longer cared. This chapter of his life was over, and he had absolutely no intention of looking back. As Brian drove away, an unexpected sense of tranquility began to take hold inside him. The anger still simmered beneath the surface, but now it felt different, more directed, more controlled. For the first time in years, Brian felt in charge of his own destiny. He was no longer the shattered man Linda had left the night before. He had become someone else, stronger. The cityscape blurred into streaks of color as he drove aimlessly, but the destination didn't matter. Only one thing was clear, he couldn't go back to that house. Not yet. He needed distance, space to breathe, to clear his head, and to figure out his next move. After what seemed like hours, he pulled into a small parking lot by the shoreline. The sun was just starting to rise, casting the sky in a gentle orange glow. Brian stepped out of the car, feeling the crisp morning breeze against his face, and wandered toward the ocean. The steady rhythm of waves crashing against the shore was a stark contrast to the turmoil that had consumed him over the past 24 hours. Standing there, gazing out at the horizon, he felt the heavy weight of everything that had transpired begin to lift. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel cornered. The chains of a marriage that had stifled him with others' expectations had finally been shattered. As the sun climbed higher, Brian turned away from the water and walked back to his car. The decision was made. Now, it was Linda's turn to face the aftermath of her choices. He had no intention of being a spectator to her downfall. His focus was solely on rebuilding his own life, and that was all that mattered now. When Linda returned the next day, the sharp sound of her heels clicking against the hardwood floor echoed through the vacant house. She was braced for a confrontation, maybe even a heated argument where she could flaunt her newfound independence with Jeff, the life she had willingly embraced. In her mind, Brian was waiting for her. She envisioned him fuming with rage, but eventually pleading for her forgiveness. She believed she held all the cards, finally liberated from the man she had come to loathe. But after only a few steps inside, something felt off. The silence that greeted her was unnerving. The house didn't just seem empty, it radiated an eerie, almost unnatural stillness that sent a chill down Linda's spine. "Brian," she called out, her voice slicing through the oppressive silence like a blade. There was no response, only the dull echo of her own voice bouncing off the walls. She moved cautiously through the house, the sound of her heels tapping rhythmically as she made her way toward the kitchen, expecting to find him there, perhaps brooding or even broken. But he wasn't there. What awaited her wasn't his presence, but something far more jarring. On the kitchen table, meticulously arranged with a disturbing level of precision, lay a stack of papers, divorce papers. The sight of them struck her like a physical blow, immediately extinguishing the faint sense of triumph she had felt after the previous night spent with Jeff. The laughter that had so recently bubbled in her chest dissipated, leaving only a hollow void. Linda stood frozen, paralyzed, staring at the flawlessly ordered documents and the terse, unfeeling note beside them. "You made your choice. Now live with it." Her breath hitched, and her mind raced, struggling to process what she was seeing. This wasn't what she had anticipated. She had envisioned Brian devastated by her betrayal, maybe storming in with a barrage of accusations or collapsing into tears. But vanishing? That possibility had never crossed her mind. Linda's hands shook as she snatched the papers, flipping through them in disbelief. It was all real. Brian had initiated the divorce process. Everything was carefully arranged. All that was missing was her signature. "No, this can't be happening," she muttered to herself, her voice barely more than a fearful whisper. Panic surged through her, and she clumsily reached for her phone, her fingers trembling as she dialed Brian's number. Each unanswered ring echoed in her ears like a thunderclap. "Brian, please pick up," she begged, her voice laced with desperation. Overwhelmed with anxiety, she left a hurried voicemail, her words quivering with desperation. "Brian, it's Linda. We need to talk. Please, call me back." She fired off message after message, each one more frantic than the last. But none of them were read. Not a single reply. It was as if he had vanished from the face of the earth. The crushing weight of reality bore down on her as the bitter truth began to sink in. Brian wasn't waiting for her. He wasn't coming back. He was gone. With mounting dread, she ran upstairs to their bedroom, flinging open the closet doors. His clothes were missing, his shoes, his personal items, everything. She dashed to the bathroom, flinging open the medicine cabinet. Empty. It was as if he had meticulously erased every trace of his existence from their home. The full impact of what had happened hit her like a tidal wave. Brian wasn't just hurt, he had made up his mind. Standing before the empty closet, her heart raced wildly. It wasn't supposed to end like this. Linda had always believed Brian would be the one who couldn't function without her, the one who would crumble under the weight of their separation. But now she stood amidst the wreckage, feeling utterly stripped of everything she once took for granted. Stumbling, she made her way back downstairs, her mind a chaotic mess, and rushed to the computer, her pulse pounding relentlessly. In a frenzy, she logged into their bank account, desperately seeking some semblance of comfort. But what she saw on the screen was the embodiment of her deepest fears. The balance read a brutal 0. Brian had drained all the money. The savings they had painstakingly accumulated over the years, gone. He had moved every last cent into an account she couldn't access. "No," she murmured, her throat tightening painfully. He wouldn't do this. But he had. Every penny was gone. Their money, their home, their life together, it had all disintegrated right before her eyes. The enormity of the situation pressed down on her, and her head spun, her vision blurring as the reality of her decisions came crashing down on her. She had lost everything. But for what? For a fleeting, meaningless affair with her husband's boss. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her daze. It was Jeff. For a moment, a glimmer of hope flickered inside her. Jeff will make everything right, she tried to convince herself. He'll pull her out of this mess. She answered the call, struggling to keep the desperation out of her voice. "Jeff," she whispered. "I need to talk. Brian is gone. He took everything," she blurted out. The line fell silent. When Jeff finally responded, his voice was distant, detached. "Yeah." A cold shiver ran down her spine. "What do you mean?" she asked, anxiety swelling in her chest like a rising tide. Jeff sighed heavily. "Linda, what we had, it was fun, okay? It was exciting. But I'm not looking for anything serious." She felt her body go numb. "What are you saying? We've been together for almost a year," she protested, stunned, refusing to accept what she was hearing. "Yeah, and it was great," Jeff responded, his nonchalant tone cutting through her like a knife. "But I'm not here for a commitment. You left Brian, that's on you, not me." Linda tightened her grip on the phone, her whole body frozen in shock. "You're just going to walk away? After everything we've been through?" Her voice wavered, but Jeff's tone remained cold as ice. "Linda, it was your choice. You're the one who turned your back on your marriage. This mess is yours to deal with, not mine." His words stung like a slap to the face. It was your choice. The very same words Brian had written in his note. "Jeff, please," she began, her voice trembling, but he cut her off abruptly. "Listen, I've got way too much on my plate right now. I don't have time for this drama," he said, his voice distant and detached. "I think it's best if we stop seeing each other." And with that, the call ended. Linda stood there, still clutching the phone against her ear long after the line had gone silent. Jeff, the man for whom she'd risked everything, had just discarded her without a second thought, like canceling a dinner reservation. She hurled the phone onto the counter, her hands trembling violently. This couldn't be real. Her entire world was disintegrating. First, she lost Brian. Now Jeff was gone too, and with him, the future she thought she'd secured vanished. The days that followed blurred into a haze. Linda tried to put the pieces of her shattered life back together, but it was already too far gone. She packed up her belongings and moved into a dingy motel, scrambling to figure out her next steps. The glamorous life she had envisioned with Jeff had turned into a living nightmare. Each time she tried calling Brian, there was no response. Her texts and voicemails went unanswered, as though he'd vanished entirely, leaving her to face the wreckage of her decisions on her own. She considered going back to work, but just the thought of encountering Jeff made her physically ill. What had once been a thrilling affair had morphed into a humiliating ordeal. She could already picture her coworkers whispering about her behind her back, sharing knowing glances. With her marriage destroyed, she doubted she could hold on to her job much longer. Jeff could dismiss her in an instant, and she knew it. As the weeks dragged on, Linda's hope slowly began to fade. The extravagant dinners and nights in luxury hotels were replaced by lonely evenings in the cramped motel room, where the stench of stale cigarette smoke and harsh cleaning products clung to her clothes. The promises Jeff made of a bright future together disappeared along with him, leaving only bitterness and regret. Linda was now forced to confront the repercussions of her choices, consequences that had cost her everything. While Linda's life crumbled, Brian's was finally starting to come together. With the turmoil of his old life behind him, he stood at a turning point. The weeks that followed his departure were marked by uncertainty, but they brought with them a sense of liberation he hadn't felt in years. The burden of a marriage where he'd always tried to appease someone who no longer cared was finally gone. Brian realized it was time to take control of his own destiny. The first step was cutting off all ties to the past that had weighed him down. He found a modest apartment in a completely different part of town, far away from the home that held too many painful memories. It wasn't a lavish place, but it was his. There were no lingering reminders of Linda, no traces of their shared life to haunt him. This was his fresh start, a place where he could rebuild himself without the constant shadow of a failed relationship looming over him. The initial days in Brian's new apartment felt surreal. The silence was almost eerie. But this silence was unlike any he'd experienced before. It didn't suffocate him, instead, it comforted him. It was the calmness of a life no longer dictated by someone else's expectations. He busied himself with minor tasks, organizing, tidying up, and gradually getting used to his unfamiliar surroundings. For the first time in what felt like ages, Brian didn't have to explain his choices to anyone. As the novelty of his fresh start started to fade, Brian redirected his focus back to his professional life. Jeff had always belittled him, keeping him under a tight leash, making Brian feel diminished, like he was never quite enough. Those toxic dynamics had slowly chipped away at his confidence. But now, with both Jeff and Linda behind him, Brian saw this as a perfect opportunity to reimagine his path. He didn't just want to move past his personal struggles, he wanted to excel in every part of his life. One afternoon, while sitting at the kitchen table with a steaming cup of coffee, he powered up his laptop and began browsing for job openings. He wasn't merely hunting for another paycheck. Brian yearned for a role that would truly challenge him and allow him to realize his full potential. He carefully crafted several applications, showcasing his skills, years of experience, and an unshakable resolve to excel. In less than a week, responses began to trickle in. Companies familiar with his track record started reaching out, eager to bring him on board. But one offer stood out more than the others, a position at a tech startup known for its innovative approach and forward-thinking culture. Something about the opportunity sparked a fire within him. He set up an interview, and within days, he found himself sitting face-to-face with the company's CEO, sharing his vision, ambitions, and how he believed he could contribute to their growth. The interview exceeded his expectations. He walked away with not just an offer, but a promotion beyond his wildest dreams, greater responsibilities, a substantial salary bump, and a level of independence he had never tasted before. As Brian left the office, a surge of excitement coursed through him. He had finally escaped the clutches of Jeff and the stifling job that had kept him boxed in for so long. This marked the beginning of a brand new chapter in his life. With his newfound position came financial security. Brian no longer had to fret over paying bills, managing shared accounts, or navigating financial stress. He recently rewarded himself with a new car, sleek, energy-efficient, and a testament to how far he had come. For the first time, he didn't feel that usual pang of guilt that often accompanied such indulgences. He knew he'd earned it, fair and square. As months flew by, Brian found himself more engrossed in his work. His career trajectory accelerated at a speed he hadn't anticipated. This brought not only the respect of his peers but also admiration from the higher-ups. However, the promotion wasn't just about a bigger title or a fatter paycheck, it was about proving to himself that he could achieve greatness completely on his own. He was no longer the person Linda had abandoned or the employee Jeff used to undermine. He had evolved into someone far more formidable. And his progress extended well beyond his professional achievements. Brian started investing in his own well-being, both physically and mentally. For the first time in years, he joined a gym. His days adopted a new rhythm, brimming with purpose and discipline. Mornings began with brisk runs at the crack of dawn, the steady thud of his shoes against the pavement a reminder of his fresh commitment to himself. Evenings were dedicated to strength training, and with each session, he felt more powerful and self-assured. It wasn't about seeking revenge against Linda anymore, it was about reconnecting with who he truly was. Gradually, Brian began to collect small but meaningful victories. He would rise in the mornings in his new place feeling genuinely refreshed. Weekends were now spent exploring scenic hiking trails nearby, and the crisp mountain air helped to clear his mind, brushing away the lingering traces of uncertainty. He started forming authentic connections with his new colleagues, people who valued him for his capabilities and character, not for any history or past entanglements. Bit by bit, Brian was piecing together a life that was wholly his own. One evening, as he sat out on his balcony with a glass of wine in hand, he looked over the city skyline, and a sudden realization washed over him. He was content, truly content. It wasn't the superficial happiness that stemmed from material wealth or career advancements, though those were still important. No, it was a deeper satisfaction, the kind that comes from emerging victorious after a dark chapter in your life and coming out stronger on the other side. Occasionally, Linda still flitted across his mind, but those memories no longer stung. They didn't have the power to haunt him like they once did. Now, she was merely a shadow from the past, a part of his history that no longer wielded any influence over him. He had grown, he had evolved, and most importantly, he had moved on. Linda may have tried to break him, but ultimately, all she managed to do was set him free from a life that was stifling his true potential. Sitting there, a faint smile touching his lips, Brian thought back on how far he had come. He now possessed everything he had once been too afraid to chase. As for where Linda was, he didn't have the slightest idea. But, for the first time, he realized that he simply didn't care. Her decisions had led her down a path that was now irrelevant to his life. Their roads had parted, and for Brian, that was the greatest blessing of all. He had stumbled upon a profound truth: his happiness was solely his own responsibility. This understanding settled heavily within him as he watched the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of golden amber. He raised his glass quietly in a personal toast. His life, once shattered by the collapse of his marriage, had been meticulously rebuilt with a strength he never knew he was capable of. What he now held was fresh, more meaningful, and he sensed that this was just the beginning of something even greater. While Linda's world crumbled under the weight of her own actions, Brian's world was finally starting to blossom. He now had full control over his destiny, free to shape his future as he saw fit. Time moved on, but Linda's remorse only deepened as each day passed. The thrill of her relationship with Jeff had long since faded, leaving behind only the harsh reality of what she had sacrificed for a fleeting moment of excitement. She had traded away her marriage, her sense of security, and the life she once knew. Now, all she was left with was to bear the burden of her choices, alone and consumed by regret. Initially, Linda tried to convince herself that things would improve. After Jeff left, she clung desperately to the hope of starting anew. She went out on dates, hoping to recapture that sense of adventure, but none of it filled the void. The men she met lacked the stability and kindness that Brian had provided with such ease. They were self-centered or unreliable. Despite her repeated efforts to move on, the emptiness inside her remained unrelenting. There were countless nights where Linda lay awake, staring vacantly at the ceiling of her cramped apartment, wondering how her life had unraveled so completely. Her thoughts often wandered back to her days with Brian, their shared home, the collective memories, the peaceful moments of comfort she had once dismissed as mundane. All of it was gone now, and she had no one to blame but herself. One chilly evening, as Linda scrolled through old photos on her phone, she unexpectedly stumbled across a picture from their 20th anniversary. They were standing together on a beach, the sunset casting a warm glow behind them, and they were smiling as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. Her finger lingered over the image, and she felt a tightness in her chest. That day came rushing back to her, the surprise trip Brian had organized, the sheer joy she had experienced, and the depth of his affection for her. Tears welled up in her eyes. Before she knew it, they were streaming down her cheeks. "What have I done?" she murmured softly, burying her face in her hands as the crushing weight of regret enveloped her completely. For a long time, Linda had convinced herself that it was Brian's shortcomings, that he hadn't been enough for her. But the painful truth was that she had been the one who wasn't good enough. She had allowed herself to be led astray by Jeff's hollow promises and the thrill of something new, and in the process, she had destroyed the only thing that truly mattered to her. With each day that passed, Brian occupied her thoughts more and more. She couldn't stop herself from wondering where he was now, how his life was unfolding, and if he had finally found the happiness she had selfishly stolen from him. The notion that he might have moved on, living a life far better than the one she now felt trapped in, tormented her ceaselessly. The immense weight of her own mistakes pressed heavily on her chest, and Linda began to wonder if, by some miracle, there was even the faintest possibility for redemption. Could she somehow seek his forgiveness? The idea seemed preposterous at first. After all, she had been the one to walk away, cruelly mocking his desperate pleas for her to stay on that fateful night. And yet, the guilt was so overwhelming that she couldn't shake the need to at least try, anything, something. One afternoon, she found herself sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a blank sheet of paper. The pen hovered in her trembling fingers as she struggled to find the right words. How could she convey the depth of her remorse? How could she beg for forgiveness when she knew, deep down, that she didn't deserve it? The minutes dragged by painfully as she battled with her emotions. But at last, she took a deep breath and forced herself to begin writing. Brian, I don't know how to start this or if you'll ever read it, but I have to at least try. I've spent years reflecting on everything that happened, and not a single day has passed where I haven't regretted my actions. I understand that the pain I caused cannot be undone, and I'm not asking for forgiveness. Linda paused, feeling the familiar ache in her chest before she mustered the strength to continue. But I want you to know how deeply sorry I am. Leaving you was the worst mistake of my life. I was selfish and blind to all the love and care you showed me. Only later did I realize what I had truly lost. I thought I needed something more, something different, but now I see how utterly wrong I was. You were more than enough, and I was just too foolish to see it. She exhaled, feeling the unbearable weight of the past as she continued to write. I'm not asking for a second chance. I know that door is firmly shut. I just want you to understand how much I regret everything. You deserved so much more than I could ever give you, and I'm truly sorry I wasn't the partner you needed. I hope you found happiness, Brian. Her hand shook as she signed the letter with profound remorse, Linda. Tears blurred her vision as she reread the letter over and over again. Carefully folding the sheet of paper, she placed it gently into an envelope. She had no idea if Brian would even open the letter, but she knew she had to send it. It was the only action she could take to try to make things right, no matter how trivial it seemed. In the following days, Linda found herself consumed by overwhelming anxiety. She checked the mailbox obsessively, yearning for any sign of a response. Deep down, she knew her chances were slim, but a small part of her clung to the hope that Brian might reply. Perhaps he would see just how genuine her remorse was. Maybe he would even give her the opportunity to apologize face to face. But as days turned into weeks, the harsh truth became undeniable: there would be no reply. For what felt like an eternity, Linda's mailbox remained empty, each day passing without a single word from Brian. The silence grew louder in her heart with every ticking second. His absence wasn't just physical. He had stepped into a new life, one where she no longer had any place. She had severed their bond, and now he existed in a future where she simply did not exist. One gloomy afternoon, as Linda sat by the window listening to the rhythmic drumming of raindrops, her phone buzzed softly on the table. It was a message from a mutual acquaintance she hadn't spoken to in ages. The subject line alone made her heart skip a beat: Brian. Her pulse quickened, and with trembling fingers, she hurriedly opened the message. It was brief, just a few sentences, but its impact felt like a tidal wave crashing down on her. Brian had remarried. He had found someone who cherished him in ways Linda never could. The message mentioned that they had recently bought a house and were eagerly anticipating the arrival of their first child. Linda's grip tightened on her phone, the weight of this revelation crushing her chest, making it hard to breathe. Her vision blurred as she tried to process what she had just read. Brian hadn't merely moved on, he had flourished. He had created something beautiful, something she could never have offered him, far away from the ruins she had left behind. For the first time, the full magnitude of her decisions loomed before her in all their devastating clarity. There would be no going back. No chance for reconciliation. Brian had permanently pushed her into his past, crafting a future in which she would never have a role. As the rain trickled down the windowpane, Linda sat frozen, the silence around her deepening. This was the life she had chosen for herself, a life overflowing with regrets. And the only person she could blame was herself. She had chosen this path, and now she would have to walk it alone. Linda had never pictured her life collapsing like this, isolated, barren, weighed down by the crushing burden of her mistakes. Once, she had dreamed of a thrilling future with Jeff, the man for whom she had risked everything. But that dream had never materialized. Over time, the illusion of a better life with him crumbled, leaving her to face the stark reality of loneliness. One dreary evening, she found herself sitting in her dimly lit apartment, staring blankly at her own reflection in the window. The distant city lights shimmered faintly, but inside, her world was swallowed by darkness. The silence pressed down on her like a heavy shroud, suffocating her. It had been nearly 2 years since she had last heard anything about Jeff. He had disappeared with the same indifference with which their so-called romance had ended, without any explanations, without any apologies. He had simply vanished, leaving her alone to deal with the shattered remnants of the life she had destroyed. Just then, her phone vibrated again. She glanced at the screen, clinging to a sliver of hope. Maybe it was a job offer or a message from an old friend. But no, it was nothing but another cold reminder of her spiraling debts, a bill notification that cut through the emptiness of her barren world. Linda's financial situation had unraveled completely. A string of impulsive decisions, steep divorce costs, and the abrupt loss of her support network had left her utterly isolated. The so-called friends who once encouraged her affair, planting seeds of doubt about Brian's worth, vanished the moment her world started to crumble. Now, she was viewed as a burden, a woman people went out of their way to avoid. With a deep sigh, she ran her fingers through her hair, thinking back to those days when life seemed straightforward and manageable. Brian had always been the one who took care of everything. He managed their finances, kept the household running smoothly, and made sure their lives were orderly. It wasn't until she lost it all that Linda realized just how much he had done for them. Now, she stumbled through a world that seemed indifferent to her achievements and failures alike. Once again, her thoughts drifted back to Brian, as they so often did these days. It had become a painful obsession, tracking him, watching the life he now thrived in without her. A few months back, she stumbled upon his new social media profiles, even though he had blocked her on all the ones they used to share. His life seemed to have blossomed in her absence, a stark contrast to the stagnant, empty existence she now led. In every photo, Brian's smile was broader than she remembered, especially in the ones where he was with his new, gorgeous wife, Jessica. Linda had learned Jessica's name by accident during a brief chat with one of Brian's old acquaintances at the supermarket. Jessica appeared to be everything Linda wasn't: compassionate, loving, the kind of woman who would never undervalue Brian. The latest post showed them vacationing in Paris, a place Linda had always dreamed of visiting, but never prioritized. That image burned itself into her memory, leaving behind a dull, throbbing ache. With a frustrated shove, she slammed the laptop shut, as if she could physically shut out the painful memories. But the weight of regret hung around her like a shadow. Even after all these years since the divorce, the feeling of remorse remained as raw as the day she walked out. Every choice she had made since leaving seemed like just another misstep, pulling her deeper into a pit with no exit. Her phone buzzed on the table beside her, but it wasn't another overdue bill. It was an email from a recruiter, yet another rejection for her most recent job application. Her once thriving career had crumbled after word of her affair spread through their shared social circle. It didn't take long before those whispers reached her office. Soon enough, doors that had once opened effortlessly for her slammed shut. She became infamous, the woman who left her husband for his boss. No company wanted to be associated with the scandal that seemed to cling to her, and over time, her resume transformed into a patchwork of short-lived jobs and abrupt dismissals. Now she worked as a secretary at a small real estate agency, far removed from the prestigious positions she used to hold, just to make ends meet. Her salary barely covered the rent and utilities, and her savings had long since dwindled away. Without a safety net and with no promising opportunities on the horizon, her future looked bleak. Desperation clawed at her, pushing her thoughts back to the one option she had avoided for so long, reaching out to Brian. Linda couldn't rid herself of the idea that if she could just find the right words, maybe, just maybe, he would see the changes she'd made. Maybe then, he would finally understand. She held on to the hope that there had to be some way to rebuild what had shattered between them. Brian had once been so understanding, so patient. Surely, that part of him couldn't have vanished entirely. It had to still be there, somewhere, even if buried deep within. Filled with a sudden surge of determination, Linda opened her laptop and started searching for any way to reach out to Brian. It didn't take long for her to locate his new consulting firm, one he had recently established, yet another sign of how well his life had progressed since their separation. She paused, her hand hovering over the mouse, hesitating before she finally clicked on the contact details. His professional email address glared back at her from the screen. Her fingers hovered above the keyboard, but she was at a loss for words. What could she possibly say that hadn't already been said? She had previously sent him a heartfelt letter, pouring out all of her regrets, but he had never responded. What could she write now that would make this attempt any different? Despite her hesitation, Linda began to type. Brian, I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from, and I completely understand that. But I need to express how deeply sorry I am for everything. I was selfish and ended up destroying something so valuable. Since then, not a single day has passed without wishing I could undo what happened, though I know that's impossible. I'm not asking anything from you. I just need you to know how truly sorry I am. I've seen all that you've accomplished since I left, and even though it hurts to know I'm no longer a part of your life, I'm genuinely happy for your success. I hope that one day you'll be able to find it in your heart to forgive me. Linda. She stared at the screen, her heart pounding furiously. It felt like an eternity as she struggled with herself. What was she doing? Wasn't this beneath her? Wasn't she supposed to be stronger than this, better than some desperate ex-wife grasping at the remnants of a past she had shattered herself? But what else did she have left? Before she could second-guess herself, Linda hit send. The email vanished into the digital void, carrying with it the last fragments of hope she had been clinging to. The days blurred together after that. She constantly refreshed her inbox, waiting for any sign that Brian had read her message. But as the days turned into a week and then two, the crushing reality of his silence began to sink in. There was no response. He had moved on with his life, and he had every right to. Linda knew she needed to come to terms with it, but the realization left her feeling hollow and broken inside. There would be no reconciliation, no closure. Brian had found the happiness she had robbed from him, and she was left with nothing but the aftermath of her choices. Yet what she couldn't shake off was that Brian's silence wasn't just a refusal to acknowledge her, it was a final, unwavering declaration that he had completely erased her from his life, as though she had never even existed. The pain of it cut far deeper than she had ever imagined.